Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jack Horkheimer speaking. Most of you know me as the host of the nationally syndicated PBS television series Star Hustler. But my real job is that of director of this planetarium. And in that capacity, I frequently author the multimedia shows seen inside this dome. The show you are about to see is one of these, and although its subject is Mars, it is a highly personal view, and I deeply hope you will enjoy my sharing my thoughts and feelings with you. And now, on behalf of the entire staff of the Space Transit Planetarium, may I invite you to sit back and relax and prepare to take a journey out into space and back into time.
The year 1988 will be remembered by Mars enthusiasts for three things. Number one, Mars' closest and brightest approach to Earth since 1971. Number two, the official reopening of the direct exploration of Mars by the launching of twin Mars-bound Soviet spacecraft. And number three, the 50th anniversary of a radio broadcast that became the most significant Mars-Earth event up to that time. Inasmuch as a modern planetarium is a good place to simulate time travel, at least as far as the visible stars and planets are concerned, let's explore the red planet that has captivated man's imagination over the millennia by taking a trip into the past. A 14,000-year Mars odyssey through time. Our first step back in time will be barely a tick of the cosmic clock, a mere wink of the eye, so that after our great dome darkens and the stars pepper the night sky, the heavens you see overhead will be those exactly as seen across North America at 8 p.m., the night before Halloween, October 30th, 1938.
The makers of Chase and Sanborn Coffee, blenders and roasters of fine coffee since 1864, present Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Bud Abbott and Lou Costello.
On this Sunday evening, in a pre-rock, pre-video, pre-new wave, low-tech USA, millions of Americans are engaged in the national after-supper Sunday night ritual of the entire family gathering around the radio, listening to the weekly live broadcast of ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his wisecracking dummy Charlie McCarthy. But this week's episode will end strangely for almost 1 million listeners, who at exactly 12 minutes past 8, as the jokes break for a musical interlude, will reach out to twist the dial briefly to sample another program. And then, the hearthside laughter from all those village, town, and city living rooms across an America of a gentler time will quickly turn into screams of terror.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell...
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the latest bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. It is reported that a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton. The flash in the sky was visible within a radius of several hundred miles, and the noise of the impact was heard as far north as the...
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Carl Phillips again, out at the Wilmot Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. I guess that's it. Yes, I guess that's the thing directly in front of me, half buried in a vast pit. Must have struck with terrific force. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Incredible as it sounds today, on this pre-Halloween night exactly half a century ago, normally placid people ran in a state of panic into the streets with wet towels over their faces to protect them from poison gas, fled to the woods to hide, jammed police switchboards, had heart attacks, and yes, even committed suicide, rather than face death at the hands of the supposed invaders from Mars. Surveys showed that at least 1.7 million Americans believed that the broadcast was real, when in fact it was nothing more than an exceptionally vivid radio drama with a new You Are There twist, masterminded by the then young genius Orson Welles. Were such a dramatic stunt pulled today, there would undoubtedly be lawsuits from here till 2001. But 50 years ago, America, indeed the entire world, was much different. In pre-World War II, 1938, the majority of adult Americans never ventured more than 50 miles from where they were born in their entire lives. And most people paid little attention to events other than those concerning their immediate surroundings, unless a war or presidential election came along. Thus, it was not surprising that the radio cast of the Martian invaders was taken as a serious national news happening. By the same token, if someone in 1938 would seriously have suggested that human beings would walk on the moon or send robot spacecraft to Mars and the outer planets within the next 50 years, that someone would have been politely called out of touch with reality, or less politely, crazy. But it was just some of those out of touch with reality people, some of the so-called crazies, who turned the science fiction of 1938 into the science fact of a space age that would dawn only 20 years later, in October of 1958, with the launching of the first artificial satellite. And man would walk on the moon only 31 years later in 1969. And, ironically, less than 38 years later, in 1976, Americans would land robots on Mars, the very planet that caused all the commotion. Indeed, Mars, more than any other single object in the night sky, was responsible for the space age dawning in our lifetimes. And it is this story of bizarre and wonderful coincidences which we are now pleased to tell.
Several thousand years before recorded history began, our ancestors saw the same stars, planets, and star patterns we see today. But because ancient man lived much more with nature than we do, they knew the night sky far better than we. Exactly what heroic and animal figures they constructed with their imaginations out of these self-same stars we will probably never know. Although a few star myths we still tell today may actually have survived the 14,000-year journey by word of mouth. At any rate, we do know that all thinking creatures in times past used the nightly, monthly, and yearly repeated motions of the sun, moon, stars, and planets as a kind of primitive clock, a method of keeping time. And although these stars, which we see above us now, the stars of 12,000 BC, are the same stars we see today, there is one important difference. For even though all these stars will appear to slowly rotate night after night about a fixed point in the heavens, nevertheless, that fixed point, called the pole point, or the North Pole star of the heavens, is in a far different spot than it is in the 20th century. It's not near the North Star of the 20th century at all, the one we call Polaris, the end star in the handle of the Little Dipper. Indeed, the North Star of 12,000 BC is the bright star Vega in the constellation we call Lyra the Harp. Few planetariums in the world can demonstrate this phenomenon, but with our space transit computers, we have the capability of duplicating the apparent motion of the stars around Vega 14,000 years ago. And so, with the flip of a switch, we will now activate our computers and show in just a few moments of time what it took ancient man all night to see. Imagine what it was like to be alive at this time, having little more knowledge than necessary to survive. Imagine what it was like to watch this circular celestial parade of stars night after night, year after year of your very short life. Imagine how magical, mysterious, and awesome these heavens must have seemed to the people of this long ago time. Indeed, we now know that almost all ancient cultures came to the conclusion that the stars were divine, each star a god, fixed in position relative to the others, for all eternity it seemed, because as a person went from youth to old age, he or she saw the same stars in the same fixed patterns year after year, the same at age 5 as at age 30, if one was lucky enough to live that long. And the nature and motions of all the objects in the night sky were completely unfathomable. Thus thousands of exotic and complex religions evolved in cultures long since gone. How could these people of the past ever know that the only reason the stars appear to parade across the heavens night after night is simply because our Earth is a ball that rotates on its axis from west to east, thus creating the grandest optical illusion in all of nature, the illusion of the stars rising in the east, circling overhead, and setting in the west. This steady regularity of a rotating nighttime sky was one of the most stable things in early man's environment, something he could rely on, because certain stars always appeared in the same place at the same season year after year. And so early man constructed great imaginary figures in the heavens by mentally connecting individual star gods, making star patterns which we call the constellations, divine patterns of starry gods which made regular, predictable appearances at specific times of the year, and thus gave some order to man's existence. But not all the sky gods were in harmony. There were a few exceptions, peculiar lights which slowly moved among the others and constantly changed their position, brightness, and color, sometimes disappearing for a while and then reappearing. And most all ancient cultures believed that these strange lights were greater gods than the others, and that their peculiar activities were divine messages, omens, and warnings from them, expressing their pleasure or displeasure with the doings of man. We today, of course, call these peculiar lights the planets, a word which in ancient Greek literally means the wanderers. And if we could compress a few months' time into a few moments, this is what we'd see. Every time the moon goes around once, a month has gone by. And this dramatically shows by contrast how very much slower the wandering gods moved. Most planetariums can demonstrate this, but unfortunately, no planetarium yet built can duplicate the dramatic dimming and brightening and color changes of the planets. Once, however, you've personally experienced watching a planet move, brighten, and change color over a period of several months' time, you'll find it easy to imagine how potent and powerful an effect these wanderers had on ancient man.
In the 1,000-year period before the beginning of the Christian era, the wandering god star we call the planet Mars went by many names. Because it not only changed its brightness, but often changed its color from a pale rouge gold to a bright sanguine red, it was almost universally associated with gods of blood and violence. The Babylonians and Assyrians called it Nergal for their god of war, pestilence, and death. The Greeks, too, called it their god of war, Ares. And following suit, the Romans invoked it as their god of battle and war, Mars, the name we still use today. In fact, in this distant era, and even in more recent times, many peoples profoundly believed that whenever Mars became very bright and blood red, it unleashed wars and revolutions, tempests and earthquakes, disaster and death. Indeed, its very symbol, even today, is the stylized Roman sword and shield.
Although there were a few exceptional individuals who, throughout the past few thousand years, came close to figuring out the true nature of the stars and the planets, almost all peoples until modern times regarded the heavens in purely magical, mystical, and superstitious terms. Some enlightened minds by the end of the Middle Ages did regard the wandering stars, the planets, as spheres, closer to Earth than the stars, and in that supposition they were correct. Most religious thought, however, still dictated that the Earth was the center of the universe, and various complex models had been developed to explain the wandering and brightening of the planets. But most explanations were veritable celestial whirligigs. One Earth-centered system was that of 16th century astronomer Tycho Brahe, famous for having a nose made of gold after it had been bitten off in a fight. Brahe should really have paid more attention to his teacher, Nicholas Copernicus, whose correct theories opened the door of the scientific revolution, demonstrating and confirming that all the planets, including Earth, circled around the sun, which once and for all took the kinks out of the celestial whirligig. It was now easy to see how and why the planets wandered, brightened, and dimmed. For instance, it was shown that Mars, the fourth planet out from the sun, took twice as long to make one trip around the sun as the third planet out, our Earth. Thus, once every 2 years, the Earth catches up to Mars, closes in on it, so to speak, and when they're close, like this, every 2 years, we say that Mars is at opposition. And when this happens, Mars appears at its brightest. But since Mars' orbit is not as circular as our Earth's, Mars can be much closer at some oppositions than at others, thus making it exceptionally bright. For instance, the opposition of 1988 is one of these close, exceptionally bright oppositions, with Mars at an extremely close distance of only 36 million miles. Compare this to 1995's opposition, when Mars will be 56 million miles away and much dimmer. In fact, 1988's opposition is the closest and brightest since 1971, and won't appear this bright again until the year 2003.
Hi folks, this is Art Smith, curator of the Miami Planetarium. You know, one of the problems with Mars is that whenever it comes closest to the Earth at opposition, and thus is best for viewing, it's also closer to the Sun. And the Sun's heat often stirs up dust storms, some of which can envelop the entire planet and completely hide the Martian surface from view. In fact, in 1956, when I was manning a public telescope at the old Miami Museum of Science, I was delighted because on the night before the closest approach, the detail on Mars was absolutely exquisite. And then the next night, with hundreds of people lined up to view Mars at its closest, you guessed it, a humongous planet-wide dust storm wiped out every single detail, thus proving, as Star Hustler says, that Murphy's Law is universal.
You can tell with just the naked eye whether or not there's a global dust storm on Mars. If Mars looks like the color of a yellow tennis ball, there's a huge storm in progress. But if you can detect any reddish color, it's clear skies above the red planet.
In 1610, Galileo Galilei was the first person to ever use a telescope to see details on the planets. And with the continued development of bigger and better telescopes throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, drawing Mars became a favorite pastime with many astronomers. But because of Mars' extremely small size, about half the size of Earth, good views were only possible at closest oppositions. Even then, details as seen from Earth were never really sharp. In early telescope days, it was discovered that Mars' face changed with its seasons, during which mysterious features seemed to come and go. Polar ice caps grew in winter and shrank in summer. And in 1784, Sir William Herschel, the British astronomer who 3 years earlier discovered the planet Uranus, concluded that Martian clouds and vapors meant Mars had an atmosphere, and stated that, quote, Mars inhabitants probably enjoy a situation similar to our own, unquote. In 1820, a respected German mathematician suggested growing a gigantic right triangle of trees in Siberia as an interplanetary signal to Martians that Earth harbored intelligent life, a point which some cynics say is still debated to this day. And then, during the opposition of 1877, an Italian astronomer named Schiaparelli claimed he saw a network of channels crisscrossing the planet, which linked several dark areas. Now, the Italian word for channels is canali, and in 1877, canal transportation networks were very common on Earth. Everyone was canal conscious. In fact, a new canal era was just beginning, with the Great New Canal across Suez and one in the works across Panama. These canali fired up the imagination of wealthy Bostonian Percival Lowell, who turned astronomer and frantically searched the world to find the best place to build an observatory for the express purpose of studying Mars and, ultimately, the Martian lifestyle. He built his observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, which has since become one of the most famous observatory sites in the world. And then, Lowell spent the rest of his life observing Mars at oppositions and drawing maps which successively became more and more intricate and showed canals thousands of miles long connecting dark areas all over the entire planet. Lowell concluded that Mars had to have a super race of beings who, in order to save themselves from a world that was dying of terminal drought and turning into a vast desert, had channeled water from the polar ice caps to the dark spots, which he called giant oases, so that the Martians could continue to grow food and survive. Lowell even explained the seasonal darkening and lightening of different areas of the planet, claiming that whenever it was summer in either hemisphere, the water from the corresponding shrinking ice cap flowed down the canals at a rate of 51 miles per hour, and that the darkening of the oases was simply the growth of new crops, and that the occasional appearance and disappearance of some canals resulted from water being channeled in and out of them. The Martian lines, Lowell stated, were the greatest canal and irrigation network ever conceived, and had to be an engineering triumph of a species far more advanced than Earthlings. Writing of this in a book, even the Wall Street Journal accepted Lowell's proof and called his book the most important event of 1906. And that's when the fun started. The entire world caught Mars fever. Scientists and non-scientists alike disputed and refuted, acclaimed and disclaimed Lowell. Inspired by Lowell, H.G. Wells wrote a fabulous bestseller, War of the Worlds, about a Martian invasion of Earth, which in turn was responsible for a new age of science fiction, an age which is still very much alive, an age which has delighted millions with the works of such futuristic writers as Ray Bradbury, Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, and many, many more. But Lowell, and the science fiction age which he inspired, did much more than merely amuse the masses, for it brought the night sky and the once mystical and deified stars and planets in it into a new kind of public awareness and consciousness. And for the first time in Earth's history, this consciousness stirred in some men the idea that the heavens were no longer the exclusive, unreachable realm of the gods, or worlds forever beyond man's grasp. Indeed, for although Lowell's theories directly resulted in H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which became the basis for the radio broadcast of 1938, which panicked a nation, nevertheless, it was this Lowell-inspired War of the Worlds which directly further inspired a certain young man to dream of actually building a machine that could fly to Mars. His name was Robert Goddard, and he went on to invent the liquid fuel rocket, and thus became the father of the American space program.
On December 17, 1900, it was announced in Paris, France, that a 100,000 franc prize would be awarded for the first communication with extraterrestrial beings. Martians were excluded, however, because it was thought contact with Mars would be too easy.
Mars has always been a planet of mysteries. In 1727, Jonathan Swift wrote in Gulliver's Travels that Mars had 2 moons and described their size and orbits in precise detail. 23 years later, in 1750, Voltaire also described 2 Martian moons. Strange, because famed astronomer William Herschel, using the best telescopic equipment of his time, couldn't find any trace of Martian moons in an intense search for them during the opposition of 1783. Neither could astronomer Heinrich de Rest find any during the oppositions of 1862 and 1864. In fact, it wasn't until 1877 when American astronomer Asaph Hall, with the newest and best telescope of his time, actually did discover that Mars had moons. How many did he discover? You guessed it, 2. How, you might well wonder, did Swift and Voltaire know 150 years earlier that Mars had 2 moons indeed?
In 1959, in his book Intelligent Life in the Universe, Russian astrophysicist I.S. Slavsky calculated that Phobos, one of Mars' 2 moons, was spiraling downward toward the planet, though this would imply virtually nil mass, meaning therefore that Phobos had to be hollow. American astronomer Carl Sagan concurred therefore that Phobos might be a great artificial satellite containing the history, knowledge, and greatest works of the Martians, who before they escaped their dying planet placed it into orbit so that future explorers to Mars might know of their once great race. This intrigued Sagan so much that he campaigned to have the flight path of an American spacecraft diverted to take close-up pictures of Phobos before Phobos crashed into the planet and destroyed all the evidence. The inevitable question followed: if Phobos is artificial, then where did all the dying Martians go after they left? To the more hospitable next planet, closest to the sun, perhaps? Are we the descendants of that once mighty Martian race?
In 1969, the spacecraft Mariner 7 was unable to get a close-up shot of Phobos. However, it did get a shot of Phobos' shadow cast on the Martian surface, showing that Phobos was not round like other moons, but elliptical, which some said might be expected if Phobos was indeed an orbiting time capsule.
With much effort, Carl Sagan finally did get NASA to detour the flight path of Mariner 9 to Mars so that it included a side trip to its 2 moons. And in 1971, astronomers all over the world anxiously awaited the first close-up pictures as they were sent back to Earth. The moon Deimos measured 6 by 7 by 10 miles and had a strange pendant-like shape. But Phobos, over twice as big, measuring 12 by 14 by 17 miles, turned out not to be an ancient time capsule of Martian lore, but looked more like a pockmarked, dried-up baked potato. Sorry about that, National Enquirer.
We'll have Manhattan, the Bronx, and Staten Island, too.
Because Mars is so small and so far away, no telescope on Earth can ever hope to capture any real, clear details of the Martian surface. In fact, this telescopic view is about as good as it gets. Thus, Mars was high on the list of early space missions. In 1965, the U.S. Mariner 4 became the first successful spacecraft to ever capture any detail on the Martian surface. Its primitive camera system glimpsed a few intriguing craters, but no canals. And in September of 1971, as Mariner 9 approached Mars, as Mars was coming into opposition, NASA waited for what it thought would be the best Mars pictures yet. For Mars looked crisp and clear in Earthbound telescopes. But just as Mariner arrived in early October, the greatest Martian dust storm of the century covered the entire planet. For 3 months, all Mariner saw was a dust-covered world. But finally, in February of '72, the storm clouds cleared. But still no canals, although what looked suspiciously like ancient riverbeds appeared. Intrigued, NASA prepared to launch its most sophisticated Mars craft ever designed, the Viking orbiters and landers. And in 1976, as America prepared to celebrate its 200th birthday, the Viking explorers sent back the most detailed pictures ever seen as they approached the tiny, distant red world. As the Vikings closed in, clouds could be seen streaming across the top of an enormous, ancient, extinct volcano. And a deep gash, thousands of miles long, revealed itself to Vikings' eyes. Then, as the Vikings went into orbit, bits of pictures were sent back to Earth. And after these bits were put together into larger pieces, like tiles in a mosaic, great new scenes unfolded. Craters abounded, and there were indeed channels, although not the ones that Lowell saw. For although these were huge, they were still much too small to have been seen at Earth's distance. But they did indeed provide evidence that water flowed in great rivers eons ago. Inside these ancient riverbeds were fascinating so-called islands in the stream, although any streams had long since vanished. But where had they gone, these phantom rivers of Mars? One great mosaic showed a strange Martian valley more than 30 miles across, which some experts said came about when water, frozen below the Martian surface, suddenly melted, causing both the ground to collapse and a great flood of water to explode up and out, which may have been the source of the ancient streams. The Vikings' orbiting eyes peered down volcanic throats and sent back more pictures, which, after being fashioned into a photo mosaic, revealed the largest volcano ever seen in the solar system. Then, on July 20th, a Viking lander touched down and sent back, for the first time in human history, vistas from the surface of another world. A rock-strewn, wind-swept view unfolded before Vikings' eyes, and then a robot arm reached out, scooped up a handful of alien soil, and proceeded to analyze it in a remotely controlled laboratory deep within Vikings' bowels. Did life ever exist on Mars? Maybe yes, maybe no. Vikings' life experiments were inconclusive, but hundreds of tests were performed on the Martian atmosphere and environment and proved that while Mars is a rugged world and will demand equally rugged pioneers, nevertheless, man will one day be able to walk here and explore its mysteries and its riches hidden beneath its surface. Temperatures in the summer can reach 70 degrees at high noon, but most of the time, temperatures are more than 100 degrees below zero, and the thin 95% carbon dioxide atmosphere will require the building of contained environments for the first settlers from Earth. Unexpectedly, the Vikings lasted not months, but years beyond their planned lifetimes, thus making it possible to actually see the Martian landscape change with the seasons. Seasons which some of our descendants will surely grow to know and feel and use to mark the seasons of their lives, as we do the seasons of Earth.
It has long been theorized that moon rocks may have arrived on Earth even before the Apollo astronauts brought them back, because it can be demonstrated that if a meteoroid, asteroid, or comet of sufficient size slams into the moon, lunar material can be splashed so violently that it can escape the moon's gravity and be captured by Earth's gravitational field. Carl Sagan, in the May-June 1988 issue of the Planetary Report, says there have also been good cases made for the view that some meteorites may have come from Mars. But only in the past few months has this view been taken seriously by the scientific community, and until just recently, only a few meteorites found in Antarctica were suspected of having originated from Mars. Then, in a phone conversation we had in late August of '88 with meteorite specialist Robert Haig, he confirmed that meteorites which landed in Nigeria are now also believed to be Mars rocks, some of which Haig gathered in a Martian rock hunt in July of '88. But how can we tell if these meteorites are Mars rocks? Well, for one thing, these meteorites are unlike any previously found because they are of recent volcanic origin. And the planets closest to Earth with known volcanoes are Mars and Venus. What may be the Mars clincher is that when these meteorites were split apart, the gases trapped inside bubbles within the rocks turned out to be the same gases and in the same proportions as in the rocks scooped up and analyzed by the Viking landers. This recent find has caused the price of these maybe Mars rocks to skyrocket. But we were able to talk Robert Haig into lending us a 100-gram piece to be put on exhibit during the course of this show, and we purchased a much smaller piece so that each of you can actually step on it as you walk through our exhibit, which, to my way of thinking, will make you among the first human beings ever to walk on Mars, and therefore become an honorary card-carrying Martian long before any future astronaut actually walks the Martian surface.
The saga of the Martian moons continues, and in mid-1989, a Soviet probe will zap Phobos with a laser to analyze the chemical makeup of the vapor released, so we can determine whether or not Phobos is a real moon or perhaps a captured asteroid. Both the European Space Agency and the United States are partners in the Phobos mission, and aboard one of the Phobos probes is a plaque honoring Asaph Hall, the American who discovered both Martian moons. Incidentally, Phobos and Deimos were named by Hall, Phobos meaning panic and Deimos terror, appropriate companions for Mars, the god of war. And just to show the 20th century scientists are not without their own personal brand of whimsy, they named the two largest craters on Deimos Swift and Voltaire, after those two writers who so long ago somehow knew the correct number of Martian moons.
Okay, we've kept you in suspense long enough. Just how did Swift and Voltaire know that there were two Martian moons, long before they were discovered? Were they super psychics? Or had they been given the information by little green men in UFOs? No, not at all. You see, back in 1610, Galileo discovered that Jupiter had 4 moons. And at the time of Swift and Voltaire, astronomers were looking for a planet between Mars and Jupiter, which they believed had to exist because of a then popular but now erroneous astronomical law called Bode's Law. Using a telescope, people of this time could look at Venus and Mercury, the planets closer to the Sun than Earth, and see that neither one had a moon. Knowing then that the next planet, which is Earth, had 1 moon, and that Jupiter had 4 moons, Swift and Voltaire conjectured that the lost planet between Mars and Jupiter should have 3 moons, and therefore Mars, the planet between it and Earth, should have 2 moons. Let me repeat that. According to Swift and Voltaire, if the Earth has 1 moon, the next planet Mars should have 2 moons, the next lost planet should have 3 moons, and the next Jupiter should have 4. Lucky guess, fellas, but you'll have to do better than that to win the lottery.
A dozen years have now passed since the Vikings landed on the Red Planet and, like the Vikings of old, discovered a new world. Yet we seldom hear of it except for an occasional bit of sensationalistic news, like last summer's hoopla about a so-called face on Mars, a picture actually shot years ago by one of the Viking orbiters. Could it be a mile-long structure fashioned by intelligent beings? Well, you can read for yourself what Herald science editor Stephen Doig wrote about it in our exhibit. I remember, too, all the fuss over this Viking picture. Some said that if you look closely, way off, just over the horizon, you can see the tops of buildings of a distant city. But when computers cleaned up the picture, the so-called lost city turned out to be just more rocks on the horizon. And perhaps some of you have seen this photo of striking geometric patterns near the south pole of Mars, which some said are the ruins of an ancient metropolis, when in actuality they are a complex of ridges created by fractures and erosion. Yes, sad to say, Mars is now rarely heard of or read about, except for occasional bits from the tabloid press, or, as in 1988, during a close opposition coupled with the launch of a Soviet probe and the 50th anniversary of an antique radio broadcast. And even I have to admit that some people in my profession have become a bit blasé about this not so mysterious as it used to be planet. And this really bothered me as I prepared to write this Mars show back in the autumn of '87, where I asked myself, had all the fascination with Mars gone? Had it dissipated because we learned that there were no Martians, no super civilizations, that Percival Lowell's canals were mere illusions caused by eye fatigue after hours at the eyepiece of low-tech telescopes? Had Mars lost its lure because it wasn't the science fiction adventure we hoped it would be? Did Mars reality fail to live up to its fictional expectations? Did we really prefer Mars fantasy to Mars reality? Yes, that had to be the reason. And I found it almost impossible to write about something that had lost its attraction and ceased to be of much interest. And so I surrounded myself with dozens of Mars books and hundreds of photographs and decided to search for what it was that was missing in the new Mars experience. Why the old Mars fantasy was preferred to the new Mars reality. I had to find out how we could become so dispassionate about a world which we, in the last quarter of the 20th century, have seen for the first time in all of human history. A world deified by millions of our ancestors and whose real nature almost the entire of humanity could never know. A world that changed the course of human destiny throughout history. A world that has wandered across the night sky above Earth for over 4 billion years. What was wrong, I wondered, with our high-tech society that we could become so quickly disinterested in one of the most incredible steps ever made by man, a step off of our world and onto another. Then, one afternoon, a recently reprocessed photo came across my desk, and as I stared at it, I began to understand why. I had seen this earlier version of the picture before, which was the painstaking result of the piecing together like a giant jigsaw puzzle of over 100 old Viking images into a mammoth mosaic, an outline of the United States superimposed on it to show scale. But the picture in front of me on my desk was as different from this as night is from day, because the computer bits that had made up the old picture had been reprocessed through the latest and most sophisticated imaging computers ever designed. As I gazed fascinated at the new view of Mars, I realized that the pictures of Mars, which most of the public had ever seen, were unrefined and poorly reproduced, and emphasized how unearth-like Mars was, how barren, forbidding, and uninviting a world it was. Even the old fictional Mars, with all its warlike invaders, was more humanly relatable. I now knew what it was that was missing in the new Martian reality, and why the old Mars was so preferred to the new. Because the new Mars picture said something much different about Mars. Something that had never been said before. This picture said that Mars was beautiful, exquisitely beautiful, and magnificent. And for the first time, I felt as if I really were looking at a new wonder of creation. I knew then what I wanted to do with the Mars show, which you are now seeing, and it is simply this. We want to show you a new world, a world of beauty, grandeur, and wonder, the magnificence that is Mars. And so, in the last few moments remaining in this show and in our exhibit, we would like to give you impressions, and only impressions, of a new Mars. Not hard science, not statistics, but impressions, which we hope will make you walk away from the show just a little different than when you arrived, so that every time you read of Mars or look up and see it in the night sky, you will think of Mars not as a far-off alien world, but as a new and beautiful world, a world which you now know. When you think of Mars, think of a Grand Canyon, but not the one of Earth, for the Grand Canyon of Mars, which is now called the Valley of the Mariners, is almost 3,000 miles long and would stretch from coast to coast across the entire USA. Indeed, our own Grand Canyon is only the size of one of the many small side canyons that branch off everywhere along the length of this great valley. In fact, if we zoom in closer on the very center of this great gash, we can see the eerie and ghostly beauty of Candor Chasm, believed to be the remains of a huge ancient lake bed, twice the size of Lake Okeechobee. And when you think of volcanoes, think not of Vesuvius or Mount St. Helens, for the volcanoes of Mars dwarf any Earth has ever known. These three giants, lined up in a row, almost stagger the imagination, for they are each over 15 miles high and 250 miles wide. Perched on top of a 6-mile-high bulge geologists call the Tharsis Ridge, and lined up and equally spaced like the three belt stars of Orion the Hunter in winter's skies, I call these three mountains the three sisters of the Tharsis Ridge. The caldera, that is the mouth of the volcano of the bottom sister, Mount Arsia, is itself so huge, over 85 miles across, that most of America's largest cities could easily fit inside. But the three sisters have an even bigger brother, and if we could fly just up to the left, to the northwest of the three sisters of the Tharsis Ridge, we would see their giant sibling Olympus Mons, the Martian Mount Olympus, which is now known to be the largest volcano on any planet. How big? Well, in comparison, the highest mountain on Earth, Mount Everest, is 5.5 miles high. And a 747 cruises about 7 miles high. But Olympus Mons is over twice that, towering 17 miles above the Martian surface. The cliffs alone surrounding its base, almost a 4-mile sheer drop. And its base is so huge that were Olympus Mons brought to Earth, it would completely cover the state of Arizona. This is the new Mars, more beautiful than we ever imagined when the first pictures came back over a dozen years ago from our robot Vikings. And as beautiful and as grand as it appears on our dome, you will only begin to appreciate the real beauty of these vistas when you see them up close in our galleries, where we took 3 of the most impressive views ever made of Mars and had them blown up bigger than anyone has ever seen them before in the special color process called Cibachrome. When you view them yourself, you will see that Mars is a planet of shimmering golden beauty, a Mars which only we, of all humans before us, are now privileged to see, a Mars of mountains and canyons, deserts and dunes, of ice, of snow, of clouds, a Mars which, after today, you will somehow feel and know as a world every bit as beautiful as the one we call our own. And from this day on, whenever you think of Mars, think of the grandest of canyons, the biggest of brothers, and the three sisters of the Tharsis Ridge.
The stars, they're still there. And the planets, too, the same as they were 50 years ago on that strange pre-Halloween night, which some of you in the audience perhaps may even remember. I do. But we, today, of this time, are as different and as far removed from the ways and the world of a 1938 as the people of that time were different and removed from those of 500 years ago, when Columbus and the peoples of Europe likewise discovered a new world. Could anyone of that time have even imagined who would inherit that new world? I think not. How then can we of this time likewise foresee 500 years into the future? And yet I think that it's safe to say that those to come will have the same dreams and hopes, ambitions and aspirations as we and those who've gone before us. And I think that someday, perhaps, they'll sing songs about the Tharsis Ridge and what it was like in the old days when only the brave and the hardy dared to attempt the labyrinth maze of the great Mariner Valley. And surely, wondering eyes from time to time will look up at the heavens and see a strange light, not seen in our skies, the old world light we call home.